Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton, and today we are going to be talking all about the Yale Youth Poll and the future of polling here in the United States in the wake of the 2024 presidential election. You want to tell us first a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work?
Yeah, absolutely. To introduce myself, my name is Jack Dozier. I am a sophomore studying political science and history at Yale University. I'm originally from a small town in central Virginia called North Garden, and I am also one of the co-founders and deputy director of the Yale Youth Poll. Um, the Yale Youth Poll is the nation's largest public opinion poll that is reoccurring and studies young adults. We focus on a lot of issues such as civic engagement, governmental reforms, and we're also trying this new thing that we basically are calling a civics quiz in the middle of the poll. So the traditional polls will ask, mainly matters of, public opinion and seeing, oh, are you going to vote for this person? Do you tend to vote with this party? And we of course include the regular horse race questions, but we also include the civics quiz. So it asks questions like who currently holds the majority in the House of Representatives or the Senate, or you know what was the political affiliation of the previous sitting president. And our poll, unlike a lot of the other youth polls out there, studies both young Americans, that's going to be ages 18 to 29, as well as adults who are above that age group. So we split it into two sizes. Our most recent poll back in October of 2024 was an N size 2,750 for both groups. So we had 2,750 18 to 29-year-olds, and the same for the above 30 group. And so doing that, we really were able to get very interesting data where we could compare the two groups in a way that showed in that precise moment how there are large differences, in the trends of civic engagement or the broad interests of young Americans.
I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the fact that I think there's a unique strength of a poll that's specifically for young people, that's run by young people, not just like a larger polling firm that has, older people talking to our generation and trying to connect with us. We have people on the ground who are like us, who can relate to us,
Yeah,
asking us the questions that are informed by our own generation's perspective. Talk a little about the strength that you think that kind of a polling firm can have, as opposed to like a larger company like 538 when polling our generation.
sure. Well, I'll definitely start out by saying, the big firms that are pulling our generation, who are not necessarily run by people of our generation, they do incredible work. I mean, I'm always impressed by some of the work that they churn out, but I do also agree. It is really important to bring a young individual's perspective, especially we're a team of six, soon to be 12 members, and we are all, of course, from Gen Z. We're all undergraduate students with very minimal non-Gen Z kind of input on the actual instrument of the poll. We have a phenomenal advisor, Professor Josh Kalla, and he does give advice. He does help, but what he mainly does is, he's a professional. He'll help us with the wording, but he really does leave the actual building of the instrument to the associates on the poll, which I think is so important because we know, whether it's through Twitter or just kind of, you know, what's going on in the realm of young adults, whether that be through Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, whatever app you choose. We're most familiar with what, anecdotally we may think is on the minds of our peers. And this, may either be a validation or a further investigation of what is on the mind of our peers, where one of our survey results was about foreign aid to Ukraine and Israel. And that was something that kind of polled similarly to how we thought with the young adult demographic, where the young adult demographic does trend to be more left leaning or more liberal. So they selected survey options more towards limiting or ending aid to the two countries. Whereas with the older demographic, it was quite literally a 51-49 split. With the younger adults, or with the young adults, we did see um, more, I believe it was in the 60s, um, for ending or limiting aid to the two countries. And so I think that's obviously something where it's something that's affecting and is in the news 24/7. So people of any age group are very familiar with it. Whereas we this time are focusing more on, issues that may not be included in other polls, where um, in our previous survey, we talked about a lot of issues relating to social media, a lot of issues relating to some of the nuances that may get missed if you are not a member of our generation.
Having that perspective on the questions that you ask is just so important. And I think that, if you're asking the wrong questions, you're not going to get at what we're actually concerned about. So just having that
Yeah.
Gen Z perspective and input on actual questions that you ask, which is not something that we often talk about when we talk about polling errors. I think that's super important. Let's talk about the results from the fall for a minute. In your fall Yale Youth Poll, you found that Harris led Trump by 56 to 35 amongst young voters ages 18 to 29.
Mhm.
And when the November election actually hit, we found that in exit polls, Harris performed roughly around where you found at 52% to Trump's 46%. So why do you think that pollsters were better able to gauge where Harris's performance was amongst young voters as compared to where Trump's support was, where they, missed the mark by around 10 points around where Trump's performance was predicted to be and what it actually was, and Harris's performance was closer to what people were predicting.
That's a really good question. Um, Something that I've been seeing a lot, whether it be in the news or some recent research from a independent reporter and researcher, Rachel Genfaza. She has done a lot of interesting research on this. She pens the Up and Up on Substack. It's really interesting. Is that a lot of younger voters have seemingly felt shame around admitting who they were voting for, or maybe potentially were dishonest about who they were voting for because they think that the desired effect is to say, "Oh, I am voting for Harris, and my peers seem to be voting for Harris, so I should say I'm voting Harris." But what it boils down to in the end is that maybe they're saying, "Oh, I'm not voting." Maybe in polls they're saying, "Maybe I'm not voting. Maybe I'm not choosing this candidate, or maybe I'm not choosing Trump because I don't align with this." When in reality, once you get to the ballot box and you're thinking, I'm a young adult. One day I want to be able to own a house. How or which candidate will make that more plausible, or which candidate will make me um, better off than I would be with the other candidate as my president? A lot of younger voters did end up choosing Trump, where, the momentum that was seen, and it's the same with all voters, the momentum that was seen for Vice President Harris in that 100-day election was incredible. I mean, it was quite truly palpable. I had the honor of working on the campaign down in Virginia this year in my home state. And the excitement was nonstop. I mean, every day I'd be excited to go to work in a way I'd never been before because we were electing the first woman president. We had, Brat Summer was happening. And I think that excitement was definitely something that helped boost Harris in the polls. But again, for a lot of American voters, at the end of the day, it came down to who's going to have the better economy and who can lower the price of eggs, because nothing really matters for someone when you can't afford groceries, when you can't afford gas, and your perception is that Harris is going to raise the price of gas, raise the price of eggs, milk, bread, whatever it is, but then deliver on these other issues. But Trump says he's going to lower this. Well, that might be the first issue on my mind, because I mean that is incredibly important. And if your perception is that Trump is going to make you better off on the day to day, I think that's why a lot more Americans ended up choosing to vote for him in the ballot box, but maybe not as publicly in the polls due to this presumed social stigma.
In the wake of the election, I think most of the coverage has focused on more of those high profile culture war issues like,
Mm-hmm.
transgender bathrooms and sports teams and, immigration and all those different, hot button topics. how much do you think that those issues actually played into the results at the end of the day? And how much do you think that the election was simply a referendum on the economy?
Sure. That's something that I've been thinking about a lot and something that I've definitely put a lot of effort into trying to understand. Um, because of course I had my presumptions on where we were as a country, and our poll did show that we didn't necessarily survey on, transgender kids in sports or, transgender athletes. We may have not surveyed that, but we surveyed other social issues, ones that we thought were very important. Um, and the way it ended up coming out was, and abortion being another social issue, for the most part, um, they came out very positively with support. But what I said earlier being that, maybe it's not necessarily a referendum, like you said, on the economy. It boils down to, can you afford stuff on the day to day? And for someone who's maybe not affected by said social issues, the economy is going to come first in their mind. So um, if you yourself or one of your loved ones has not needed an abortion, or if there's not a situation in which you think that is your number one priority, but it's something you care about. If you see Trump saying, um, you know, kind of back and forth on, how many weeks he would allow, but saying that he'll support it, that might be something that, you can put on the back burner, while the issue of, can I pay for my day to day life, and can I, get a fair wage, might be more important. And I think it did in the end really come down to economic issues. However, there are these caveats of social issues were still very important, but not necessarily accounted for as strongly in the ballot box.
Yeah, well, the economy certainly was probably the biggest driving issue for all voters overall to decide what candidate they were going to back in 2024 presidential election. But I think when we talk about the economy, we kind of like what we talked about before with the different questions that we ask young people versus older people. I think the indicators for the economy that young people are concerned about are pretty different from what older people often point to. So in the poll, how did you account for this difference in concern around young people's economic concerns versus older people's concerns? What kind of questions did you ask about the economy? And do you notice that difference playing out in the results and in the polls?
I do think that is a good question, and I would say, I'm just trying to make sure I get you the right numbers. Um, but what ended up happening on economic issues is that young voters were really more inclined to kind of talk about issues or select issues such as government funding for renewable energies, interestingly enough. Um, we saw a pretty large margin on that, a margin of difference between young voters and adult voters, saying that issues such as raising the minimum wage and increased government funding for renewables was very popular. Whereas with some of the older voters, looking at some of the economic issues, which one that was perceived as an economic issue was diversity practices in the workplace. We kind of looked at it through that lens instead of a social lens, because for a lot of the voters that we were surveying, they may have viewed this, if they were, a white heterosexual male, they might view that as an economic issue because of a perceived conception around um, their ability to get a job in the workforce. We viewed that as an economic issue, whereas with younger voters, and that was the number one economic issue for voters who are over 30. Whereas for this young adult sector, the number one economic issue was the minimum wage and raising the minimum wage to $15 nationwide. So some states, like my home state of Virginia, I think the minimum wage um, has been increasing, bit by bit over the past few years, but it's in increments. Um, Whereas you have other states, such as I believe West Virginia is still at $7.25 for their state minimum wage. So with time, or sorry, Pennsylvania, not West Virginia. With time, um, you know, there might be a conception that the minimum wage might raise with time, but with young voters, overall, that was the number one issue. It should be $15 nationwide, no exceptions.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting because I don't think that either one of the candidates were really highlighting that issue on the campaign trail. Not from what I remember.
I was just going to say, I do remember, Harris did highlight raising the minimum wage as a tenet of the campaign, but honestly, I can't remember reading anything about Trump saying that.
Yeah. Yeah, it certainly wasn't a question in the debates. And
Yeah,
you know, if it's the number one concern for young people, that's really interesting. It shows that a lot of these, polling firms are missing the mark when it comes to the economic indicators that young people are actually concerned about. That's
yeah,
interesting. So let's talk about the gender gap because I think that was one of the biggest things that we can take away from this election. Although it wasn't quite as significant as some polls were making it out to be before, the election exit polls showed that Trump won young men by 56% and won, 40% of young women, which is actually a 10% increase from 2020. So what do you think are differences in the minds of young people in 2020 and in 2024 that led them to support Trump across gender? Um, but what do you think is, the difference between what men were thinking and women in this election?
yeah. That's a good question. So, one of the issues that we saw pretty quickly in the poll, when we were first looking at the results as a team, was that Harris had lost the most ground with significantly lost the most ground with black voters. So our poll said relative to President Biden's performance in 2020, she lost about 31.8 points in her lead with black voters compared to Biden. So that was kind of the first result that became clear to us when we were looking at the poll. And it was interesting that our poll ended up having a increase in support just in general for all men for Harris, but that is obviously something that did not end up coming to fruition, which I did think was really interesting. Um, and I do think the gender gap is a really growing issue where even in polling, it was showing that men, regardless of their racial background or social background, were supporting Harris at a higher number, and then that didn't end up being the reality. Um, which is incredibly interesting to me, given that, we have these issues or presumed social issues as being a very dividing force for young voters. Um, so I did think it was really interesting that in the end, there was the difference between what a lot of polls were saying and what ended up being the actual, outcome of this election, um, with voters who, identified as male in our polls and other polls, because I do think that in reality, the gender gap did not come out in the way that a lot of pollsters were saying. And that kind of harks back to the issue of, looking into why people were not as or not as truthful when answering polls. And maybe there's an issue in weights, maybe there's an issue in how we're looking at these polls, but I do think that there were definitely a number of factors that created this new difference.
Yeah. Let's go back to talking about polling in like a general sense.
Mhm.
In recent cycles, high quality pollsters have really missed the mark when it comes to Trump's performance across the country, and especially in swing states in the Midwest. Notably, on November 2nd in 2024, Ann Seltzer's poll from the Des Moines
Yeah.
Register found that Kamala Harris was going to win the state of Iowa, according to her prediction, by 47% to Trump's 44%. Obviously, Trump went on to win the state. He won by 56% to Kamala Harris's 43%. And in the wake of the election, Trump is suing Ann Seltzer over her polling error, and Ann Seltzer has now ended her time in Iowa politics and ended the poll that she ran for decades. So, can you talk about how do you decide to publish a poll that might have outlying data points, and how do you decide when, maybe it's too far out of the realm of possibility and maybe you wouldn't publish that poll?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, polling is expensive, um, which is why the creation of a strong instrument is the most important thing. So starting in the beginning, not having questions that may induce outliers. That was something that we looked at a lot and worked on a lot with our advisor, where he, given his experience, really helped us make sure that our questions were as bulletproof as they could be. Because, if you have questions that might accidentally sway a respondent into asking or answering in a certain way, you're going to have those weird extraneous results. If you have those weird extraneous results in higher numbers, like unfortunately Seltzer did, you kind of just lose credibility on your poll, as she also has unfortunately had happen to her recently. So we really focused in the beginning on making sure that our questions in our instrument were really able to be interpreted in a very neutral way. We made sure that no question um, really could be perceived as having a sway of one way to another. That was the first most important thing. And then the second thing, it can sometimes be weird looking at polling nowadays with samples. So if you were to do a random digit dialing poll, you're going to get a lot more older voters, and then you have to do weights, and that gets really complicated really quickly, especially when accounting for the use of landlines. So random digit dialing predominantly used landline phones just because you know where they are. You can kind of put a marker on where that line is, whereas with cell phones, obviously, they're moving around all the time. Um, but now when we think about it, I don't have a landline at home, and I know a lot of the younger demographic, even people, I think under 50, the stats were significantly dropping as to whether they had a landline at home or not. And then you have to think about, are they going to pick up? Who's going to be picking up a phone? So I do think that's why there are some extraneous extraneous answers to a lot of polls, and then in other situations you'll have opt-in polls. So for us on our poll, we did have to use some weighting, because when you have an opt-in poll, you can't really, kind of depending on how much you're paying or how or what the service that you're using, kind of can't really pick and choose the sample. If you have a really high quality one, you have more opportunity with that, so there's less room for waiting. Um, but for an online opt-in poll, you have to think a lot about who's answering this, looking at your data, and just thinking, how can we make sure that this best represents the actual demographic? And then going back to your question about how to choose whether or not to publish a poll, I do think, whether it be for credibility's sake or for, fairness and honesty towards an election, because polls obviously have a lot of power, um, whether that's for fundraising or for actual voter turnout, it's really important just to publish data that is transparent. So I think, if you have an a poll that's giving results like, um, one example that I saw in a textbook was saying, oh, if you get a poll that says, however, X percent think that you should cut down all the trees, and it's a percentage that's alarmingly high, and this was just a textbook example, you should maybe give that a little bit of second thought. Think, was the question leaning? Was my sample size too small, or was my sample, accidentally, um, or was a group accidentally overrepresented in my sample who maybe are against the trees? I don't know, but there's a lot that goes into play, and I do think the worst part is thinking about how, the pricing works out in the end. It's really hard to throw away a poll, especially if you're a smaller scale polling firm. So I think a lot of smaller scale pollsters will just weight it as much as they can to make it work. And then that's when you get answers that don't necessarily add up.
Yeah, good point. And for a minute there, you were talking about the technology, and just for our last question, I want to ask, where do you think the future of polling goes from here, particularly
Yeah.
among young people? Are there any like new technologies or developments in, sampling groups of people that you think are going to change the landscape of polling in the future? And are there other ways of gauging public opinion, like focus groups that you think could replace polling, maybe somewhat?
I actually am a huge proponent of focus groups. I took part of one where it was all young voters with that journalist, Rachel Jonfaza, that I mentioned earlier today. And it was such an interesting experience where that was, I think, the first time where I started truly doubting how young people were going to end up voting. Where it could have also been, I'll add, it could have also been a sample issue because I think it was, I can't remember the exact number, but it was a very honest conversation. It was a very interesting way to learn more about what a bunch of peers who I had never met, so a bunch of people from our generation, were thinking in that exact moment. And I've become a huge fan of focus groups. I think that building a sample of 20 or so people who come from a bunch of different backgrounds and can really give an opinion, I think that is a way that you're going to get the most honest results in the future because polling is a very complicated industry, and I actually don't know what technology is going to remain the gold standard because um, some of the polls that were published on the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, which is generally thought of as the gold standard of polling, ended up having results that didn't necessarily align with the reality of the election. So I know the future is not random digit dialing, but I think that's the only answer that I can give you right now.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here on Pod Save the Youth today. It was great to
Yeah,
have you.
thank you.
Great conversation, and everyone, we'll see you next week.